right. Well, welcome everybody to our presentation where we will be discussing our collective heuristic experiences, our first person experiences as clinicians, doing digital improvisation, focusing on entering the ambient. And so we're just going to introduce ourselves first before getting into it. My name is Michael Viega. I'm an assistant professor at Montclair State University. And Victoria?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Victoria Druziaco. I'm currently a music therapist at Maimonides Medical Center, working on a couple different adult psych inpatient units.
And hi, I'm here. Hi, I'm Al Hoberman. I'm a music therapist in New York City in private practice. I guess that's it.
Everyone, I'm Josh Milrod. I'm a music therapist in Brooklyn, New York in private practice, working with adolescents and young adults.
All right, great. And so as we begin, we just want to say a little word about our intersectionality and how digital music cultures and identities have informed our work. We like to first note that we are four white and white passing therapists, music therapists, and that a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has a history within, Black, African American, Latinx, queer cultures, with digital music cultures having its roots in areas like, for instance, Chicago, where house music and Frankie Knuckles was, Frankie Knuckles inventing house in Chicago within the Black queer culture within Chicago. And so as we talk about entering into the ambient and utilizing equipment like this, we want to make sure that we stress that when we talk about the gear, and we're not just talking about how to, but that people have to build relationships with this, and we call these instruments, and these are instruments and not equipment. And each one, like if I'm holding up an MPC right now, for instance, this has its own cultural history, its own way of engaging based out of different music cultures that that we just want to honor within the space as we begin. Personally, in the 90s, when I first was introduced to rave culture and went to my first raves in the 90s, it was really the first time as a white suburban MTV youth that I was introduced to queer culture and identities and feminist ideals within the dance floor. A lot of the promoters were female, for instance, and they were bypassing a lot of mainstream traditional ways of gathering people, putting shows on, and typically in places that you wouldn't typically have live music, for instance. So a lot of the ideals that we're sharing today and a lot of values stem from those cultures and identities. So yeah, let's get into a little bit of context here, and that we are, when we're kind of referring to entering the ambient, I just want to define that very quickly. And so let me just pull up this article here. So this is, I think, a 2014 article called listening in ambient mode, implications for music therapy practice and theory. So you can read more about it here in Voices, a World Forum for Music Therapy, in which I kind of begin to outline what ambient is and modes of listening surrounding ambient, and how I was informed, my clinical work was informed with this mode of listening. And I prioritize listening as my main assessment tool, where listening is really the umbrella for how I engage in music therapy as a clinician. And I'm not just talking about hearing listening, but also there's heart listening, there's body listening, there's all different types of ways of listening. So, and the ambient mode informed me with how I was navigating various ways of being especially within listening. So I just want to look at this, this kind of definition of the ambient mode, and to suggest, yes, there's ambient music, There's all forms of subgenres of ambient music. There's subgenres of ambient music. But what we're really talking about is ambient as a context for listening. Not necessarily ambient as a genre of music, but ambient as a mode of engaging with our surroundings, as an ambient, pervasive, all-around field, without anything being prioritized into the foreground or background. Without the salience of the foreground, what needs to become salient is the pervasive ambience itself. And so let me just put that a little bit into perspective, in that usually when we listen to music, we might prioritize an instrument, or we might prioritize a moment within the listening, or if we're doing music and relaxation, the music's in the background, the relaxation's in the foreground of our consciousness. What the ambient is suggesting is that we allow all different aspects of our environment, including the music, into the listening experience and navigate where we're at. So think of it in terms of like looking at a map, and you're seeing the whole environment, and you're able to navigate that map. And so you're thinking of sound in terms of a map, and you're able to kind of see it, but you're also able to drop in and say, oh, well, here are the mountains over here, and it has this texture, has a bumpy texture. Let me move into that texture. What's it like here? Great, let me move out. Now I'm going to move into the flat ocean or the plains. What's it like here? So we're looking at things in terms of texture and kind of navigating both environmental sound outside of the music itself, our own internal worlds, the worlds of each other, and connecting. And so really what taking that theoretical article, we're looking at as a group, the research question of what is our individual and collective experiences of entering into the ambient within digital music improvisations? What does our experience tell us about possible roles of therapists when improvising with digital technology? What do our experiences tell us about the possible role of the people we work with when improvising with digital technology? So it's a way of engaging in digital soundscapes in a way that is very intentional, of bringing in various environments, both internal and external, and what that experience is like. And what we have really, and we'll talk about more, is when improvising with digital music technologies, the relationship to the music, the relationship to instruments, the relationships to each other are very, very vastly different than acoustic, improvisations, improvisations with a lot of different instruments. If I have a kabasa, there's probably about 5 different sounds I can relate with that kabasa. I can, scratch it, I can shake it, I can tap the wood. But within these digital music technologies, our ability to sound shape and our ability to create sonic textures in relationship to ourselves and our environment is so much more vast, and the experiential of being in those digital improvisations are very, very different. And so with that, I'm going to leave it up to Josh to kind of introduce how we kind of approached each improvisation session.
Thanks, Mike. Each session, we kind of tried to set an intention for ourselves and have that intention evolve. At first, it was like, how can we be together in this music space? How can we connect? Knowing that each of us kind of comes at this from a different place. Some of us had much more tech literacy than others. Some of us had much more fluency with a specific piece of software than others. Some of us had just a more general approach to loving this music and relating to it that way. And over time, we've evolved the process to go, let's just see how we can be together in this ambient space using these musical instruments, which are not the musical instruments we were necessarily trained on in our music therapy training. And it's evolved over time to asking very specific questions about what are the clinical implications of this type of work? How can you use creating a sound with someone as an assessment tool? How can the beat be a container or facilitator? How is the experience different when you're coming in and out by creating looping material that allows you to leave the musical space and perceive the totality of it rather than create it? And I think within each of these kinds of different ways of relating and ways of being, there's lots of different levels. And in our discussion and analysis, we've been able to look at everything from the 10,000-foot view of the societal level. What does this mean? How, like, to be a white man in this music? What does this mean to be a client of color in this music? And all the way down to what are the specific tech interventions that we can use? And I say tech really kind of with a bit of pause, because I actually think one of the things that's really important, and I hope you'll see in some of the work, is that this was not about the novelty of technology. This was about us exploring musical instruments. I came to music therapy personally, not as a guitarist, not as a pianist. In my audition for the NYU Music Therapy Master's Program, I played an ambient piece improvising with trumpet and electronics. And as a result, we wanted to look at a variety of different ways of using different types of instruments. So we used a wide range of digital audio workstations, but predominantly we used a lot of Ableton Live and Logic. We would incorporate synthesizers, which felt a lot more like the things that we as music therapists had been taught how to use. We used some standalone electronic equipment like a K-oscillator or a number of other really important tools that kind of simplify it. And we processed acoustics. And I think the reason we did this is we wanted to look at this in terms of a variety of clients that we could reach. If you could mute your mic, thank you. We wanted to look at this in a variety, because the variety of clients we could reach, from the clients who were very tech illiterate to clients who are incredibly literate and can even run production sessions themselves. And one of the research questions we talked a lot about was how our clients in our actual work relate to these tools, and kind of one of the prevailing ideas that kept coming up was this idea that our clients don't see this as different. They don't see this as different than a drum circle. They don't see this as different than a sing-along with an acoustic guitar. They see this as music, because culturally, with a lot of the people I've worked with and a lot of the people my co-researchers worked with, this is their music. This is the only music they've ever known. Maybe a lot of my clients would tell me maybe they saw a piano at church or they saw a guitar on TV, but this was the music they related to. A beat pad was a much more familiar musical object than an acoustic guitar or a kabasa or a djembe. So I think what we wanted to do now is go into some of the work and actually explore how this played out.
Yeah, Victoria or Al, do you want to add anything before we jump into some video?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, but I'm thinking that I can kind of expound upon some of the ideas that Josh is introducing probably once I get closer to, once I'm actually talking about the clip that I want to share with people. But I guess just to add a little piece, you know, Josh was talking about how music technology presents opportunities for engaging in the music for people from a range of backgrounds. I would identify myself certainly as a novice in this area, approaching things as a singer-songwriter who started to mess around with music production for my own purposes of songwriting and putting my music out to share with people. You know, that impacts how I engage with the music, that impacts the color of the music that I'm bringing forth, and it impacts the choice of, you know, what instrumentation am I using. I know for myself personally, I chose a microKORG synthesizer, which is, I guess it would be akin to like a digital piano. So it's an instrument, and it's like, it's a much more limiting number of different possibilities versus these amazing complicated programs that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, like Ableton. I'm GarageBand advocate for sure. So, you know, just to be thoughtful about, you know, different ways that we can make this music accessible, and that it can be, you know, based on the choices that we make.
And Victoria is absolutely an expert at the experiential listening.
Yeah. So my context, yeah, my context that I'm coming into this group in, aside from just being really excited to work with Dr. Viega, is just getting an opportunity to engage with the music that I really love from an experiential standpoint. I love to dance. I've engaged in electronic communities. I want to acknowledge that they are, you know, most of them traditionally Black and queer communities that I've had the privilege to participate in and benefit from. That was important for me to acknowledge. And so for me, this music is really indelibly tied to movement, my experience of moving as a mode of listening to the music. So I can tell you more about how that identity and that experience has impacted my engagement in this group and the group process once we get to the video.
Yeah, so I'll open it up to Al now, but it is important to kind of note that each one of us have different expertise and levels of degree of how we've engaged with different, whether it's digital audio workstations. For me, it's been a lot of, drum machines and synthesizers that don't need software for, et cetera. So it's all different types of digital audio technologies that we've been kind of exploring and related to our own. And I got to mention that Dr. Brian Abrams has also joined us on multiple groups as what he considers himself to be a tech novice and exploring instruments that, he's never necessarily engaged with before. So we wanted a vast variety. And as we open up to Al to introduce our first clip, none of us are presenting a definitive model of how to do this, but that this is kind of our own experience that we're sharing with you, just to keep that in mind. All right, Al.
Cool. Yeah, and also even just to quickly add to that part of the conversation, I think one thing that we're all kind of getting at is that when we talk about digital instruments, we're not actually just talking about one monolithic thing, right? There's synthesizers, which are just instruments in the sense that they produce sound when you hit a note. They have some other functions. I mean, there's drum machines and other analog instruments. And then even Josh and I were both on the surface of it using the same equipment, using MIDI controllers, controlling sounds in Ableton Live. But the way that we even use those tools are so vastly different. So yeah, I mean, my background, not coming from a dance culture, but coming from an experimental and an improvisational culture, I approach this same instrument from a completely different way, just as two guitar players might play totally differently or any of that. But moving on to some of the recorded sessions that we have, I came at it thinking about what's happening musically here. So as Mike talked before about the ambient space, there's sort of an ambient mode of listening where you can zoom in or out. There's also an ambient mode of engaging, of playing. And as we started to look at some of these clips, I noticed there were really, in some sense, three categories of how to engage. So there's this really zoomed in intrapersonal mode where you might be thinking about, oh, what's the individual sound or the note that I'm playing? How am I going to achieve the next thing that I want to express? There's the interpersonal, so how do I relate to what other people are doing? What's the space for me in the sound? Can I do something rhythmically that interacts all of those things? And then also there's this other space that happens when there's so many layers of sound, because of course, when you're using looping technology, there can be way more voices than just the four that are happening. The four of us. So there becomes this kind of, almost transpersonal space where you start to even lose track of what sound you're making right now and what sound might be coming from another person. We mentioned David Ramsey's "Did I Do That" factor, where you do lose some sense of what's mine and what's yours, and it just becomes this one space where foreground and background are no longer so clearly delineated, and actually there's space for things to push forward and push back. So that being said, I'm gonna play you a clip, or I'll have Mike play you a clip in a second, which actually comes from the beginning of one of our improvisations. And this was the first one where we decided to start with a beat, just start with a basic, you know, a kick drum beat, just to give us a frame to play with. Before that, we had been starting from a totally ambient space. And so I want you to listen to how some of these elements come together, how things might shift from foreground to background, how a collective sound develops, and also includes some elements of all of those different modes of engagement. And then we'll come back and listen. Okay, so go ahead, Mike.
Yep, and this is the second session we had together.
Cool. So I think our original idea was to open this up to some discussion. That may be a bit difficult right now, but yeah, I just wanted to again highlight some of the ways that as elements repeated. So like you heard those kind of scratchy arrhythmic sounds that were coming from a couple of us. You know, they began arrhythmically, they began almost maybe in opposition to the beat. And as repetition happened, as new layers, like if you notice, once the melody came in, what happened to those intermediate layers? Did they, you know, how did they start to take shape? How did the melody help to give other elements form? Things like that. I mean, even if some of my other co-presenters have comments.
Yeah, I think, Al, you're bringing up something really interesting that actually dovetails nicely into my clip, which is this idea that once that space exists, it allows for a variety of different ways of being in it that I think are actually really interesting and provide really interesting clinical opportunities. Like, people can hide in this music a lot better than they can hide in an acoustic thing, because you have control of your
Me, I like to hide in the music.
So because everyone has an individual, but because we were recording the sessions, we could go back and review them and rebalance them and say, what was happening here when, let's say, Al was playing really loud, or Victoria was playing really quiet, or I was doing whatever I was doing. It allows for a level of indexing that I think Nordhoff Robbins people could really appreciate and could really learn a lot from. I see a question. Yeah, so Toby, we actually, this also dovetails nicely with the next clip, but we explored a variety of different ways of running through one system, but also running through each having an individual speaker, or running through a stereo field where people were panned to different places in it. We've experimented with just about every way, and I don't know that we have a solid opinion on what is best, because they each provide a different thing.
I think that's
and also
one of the
troubleshooting. Just troubleshooting the tech stuff like provides really unique challenges for working through in the group process. I just wanted to add that.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It was that each moment coming, there wasn't one definitive way to do it. That each time we came together, the setup was unique to what we were braining into the session, and that setup became part of the process in of itself.
So I think that if we're cool to move on, I think one of the things that we got to in this third session, which I'm going to show you a clip from, is this idea of what are the parallels between this work and the work we were kind of trained to do. And they're myriad. There's no shortage of them. And I think in my first job was I started a music therapy program on Rikers Island working with adolescents. And I actually never had traditional instruments until about 6 months in. So for my clients, this was music therapy. This is all it ever was. And they didn't relate to it as a different thing from the instruments when the instruments finally came. And I think all of us have talked a lot in this about the biases against tech that we hear from some of our colleagues and experience in some of our trainings. And I think it stems from a lack of fluency. And as we became more and more fluent with how to navigate these musical spaces together, we started to ask much more advanced questions about how to use the musical capabilities of these tools, not just navigate the tools. There was a lot of navigating the tools in the beginning, but what we're starting to do in this clip is navigate the music and find the parallel processes. And I think one of the things that's really good in this clip and is one of the big knocks against this kind of work, and I've heard many times from colleagues and supervisors, is the rigidity of a fixed beat. And the rigidity of a fixed beat actually provides a lot of opportunities, especially in trauma-informed care, that I think that a beat that I have to make and constantly regulate as the therapist actually hampers me. What this does is I can create a really consistent and predictable holding space from which to explore. And what you're not going to see in this clip is the 4 or 5 minutes before of us really struggling to navigate this kind of skittery beat that doesn't give you a lot to hold on to. So there were a variety of musical themes that came up and would fall away. And it was almost like we were trying to find each other because the beat was not holding us. And what you're going to hear is at the start of this clip, a drone, I create a drone, and then I begin to add to that, and then I add a snare drum on the 2 and 4. And what you see is as each of these stabilizing elements is added, more freedom is experienced in the music. So I think there's a lot of different music therapy interventions and techniques that can be explored, but I wanted to start from something that's really basic and we can all really understand, which is this idea of grounding and regulation and how those create freedom. So without further ado, our clip. So if you're, I hope you saw how that progressed over time. This was a really uncomfortable first 5 minutes. And once these grounding elements came in, and then this really regulating uh, snare on 2 and 4, it opened up the whole space. And if you saw by the end, all of our heads were nodding in unison. We were entrained, we were attuned, even though parts of the music actually were coming in and out of time. And that created just a lot of space for us to explore, but a lot of space to explore from a place of grounding and consistency and relation. And I think there was a question in here about tempo changes. And what one of the things that happened later in this session was, as this built and built and built and built, it got to a point where it was like almost suffocating. And so I slowed down the tempo drastically, which created a lot more space. So yeah, there are a lot, as the music therapist facilitating this experience, there are a lot of ways that you can use these rigid tools to create very human experiences.
Great. And we're going to move, Victoria's going to talk about session 4, but there've been, a lot of moments where we've been improvising with each other that afterwards it's like, what beats per minute were you at? And Josh would be like, I was at 120. And I'd be like, I'm at 85. And Victoria's like, I'm at, what was interesting as well.
I don't know what beat I'm at.
We were finding grooves within grooves, like we would, and that's what the kind of wash of ambient sound allowed for, was like, even if we weren't in the same beats per minute or even the same key signature, we were hearing things within it that maybe aren't apparent in typical improvisations, that the ambient allows for new modes of being within there that usually wouldn't work. Victoria, session 4.
Okay. So it is kind of interesting to see the progression of the sessions. I think it's important to give this clip some context. So the previous session, you could see that Al had not been able to join us for that group. So we do spend a good amount of this initial session kind of like bringing Al up to speed in what had happened in the previous session. We spend some time talking about tech, which isn't really a conversation that I could so much participate in. And I do want to say that I do feel, as a woman, as a white passing Latina woman, this is a context that's somewhat foreign to me. So I'm coming in with that mentality, the singer-songwriter identity, just like my relationship with melody. I feel very tied to melody in the context of music. And so we're talking to Al, we're letting him know also what kind of concepts that we covered previously in this previous improvisation that Josh showed you a clip of. And so we get onto this concept of the beat, like Josh had mentioned. And so we were in this somewhat of a debate, actually, where Al had raised this question of, well, how does music technology expand the capacity for us to try on different identities? And so identity for me, which hopefully I've been able to articulate, why that was something that was important to me coming into this group. And so Al was thinking like, okay, I think I want to expand out of this role. And I'm like, oh no, please don't make me expand yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to express myself within this medium in a way that feels authentic to me, that feels empowering, versus me feeling like this new kid who doesn't really know what they're doing and can't participate in conversation about these different like cool sounding pieces of technology that I don't really know what they are or what they do. And so I'm like having this defensive reaction, like, oh, can't we just like, I'm still trying to figure out what my identity is here. So it's funny, it's a little ironic. So after this conversation, we were trying to figure out whether or not we want to start with a beat or not. And so I had triggered something. I didn't even realize I was even doing it. And so I actually initiate this beat. And so I think I was able to step outside of my identity as this other, as this novice, and kind of play a more facilitating role in the development of this sound. And so the clip that I wanted to share with you guys is, I think, like an evolution of where this clip began, which was me taking on this different identity, daring to like be loud within a group where I kind of wanted to make myself a little bit smaller to not stick out and not have my mistakes be so in the forefront, mistakes. So you can go ahead, Mike, and play that clip. So it's a little hard to catch the nuance there because we have this wall of sound. But I just want to point out that was me using a vocoder, which is basically a vocal filter that distorts your voice. That for myself personally, I found a lot of freedom in the distortion and just being able to take on like a role that sticks out. And then I also thought it was interesting, Al, how you're incorporating the bass there and incorporating technology with that use. So I think is Al, you're up next?
No, that's me. Yeah. So,
or Mike, yeah.
So I'm going to talk about session 5, and just to let everybody know, we did 6 sessions together. At session 5, we moved into a new space, the David Ott Lab for Music and Health at Montclair State University, which I miss so much. And it has a lot of possibilities within that space in terms of different ways of setting up speakers, different ways of setting up the digital equipment, setting up the room. And so one of the things about being a music therapist in relation to digital music technologies is, you know, the technology, the process of setting up and of how to put the gear together and what gear to use. Each of those have different clinical kind of focus and intentions behind it. And so, you know, we don't have any solid recommendations because what we're finding out in our research is, man, just this one piece alone has a lot happening here. And so there's still a lot to learn about what the different technologies afford with clinical intentions, not just as outcomes, but as experiential processes. So what I want to focus on in session 5 is this moment when we began to, and part of my personal process, by the way, we always talk about, Victoria and I always talk about, is I'm ready for the moment that we can create a beat and I'm just going to get up and just dance. You can kind of see me in session 3, getting out of my chair. I almost pull a Jerry Lee Lewis and kick my chair out from under me, because what digital music technologies allow for us to be able to do is we could both be creators of the sound, but just be in the sound, enough of doing and being. So the modes of listening as a clinician is, when we're engaging with this equipment, at one level, I am problem solving. I'm actually like solving a problem within there. I'm in kind of a headspace, but I'm also attuned to the greater sound and to the relationships. All of that's going at once. So I could both be a creator of sound, but also be the participant in sound and shift those roles. I could move in the middle of the group and just freely allow my body to explore the sound and then just go back over it. So this is a moment I'm going to share where I start to free myself up a little bit and want to directly move my body in relationship to the gear. And you could see each of us, you could see Al, you could see myself, you could see each of us take a moment and breathe away from. And there's no solid beat here, but there is kind of a sense of a group pulse that's happening, but where we free ourselves from the gear itself and just allow ourselves to be in the music itself. So in that video clip, you know, I was hoping to show what different levels of experience from engaging with the instrument itself. And as you could see in that clip, I was able to trigger the sound that was being created, but in some ways be present to the group as well. So in my own experiential state, I remember that one part of my consciousness was, you know, working with the instrument, but I wanted to attune to the group members more face to face instead of being locked into the gear itself, which in other sessions I had been. And in a lot of ways, as I said, hopefully in the future, I want to detach completely and dance and maybe move to the gear, hit a button, change it, move back to dancing so that we can easily shift. And I think that's one of the primary experiential states that I think are important. You know, when we present the people we work with, when we present them with instruments, it's almost like this immediate, I have to do something with this. And there's, and it's a doing and a doing. And then if we're doing receptive music therapy, okay, now I can just be, and I'll be in the music and I'll image or dance or whatever and be in the music. Here, you know, in the ambient mode, we're able to blend and blur active and receptive musicking in a way that, you know, as we develop this more, that I hope to experience more, where I can move from receptive experiences and active experiences in a very fluid way, where it doesn't have to be, again, foreground, background, one or the other, either or, but it's a both and I think that's the possibilities of digital technology for the people we work with, is that it's not an either or, either you're playing or you're not playing, but you can do both here without the need to think about resistance or all those things. You can be actively engaged in the soundscape, even if you're just kind of even if you're not involved in the instruments itself.
Yeah.
So as we finish up this presentation, just invite you all to say some concluding words, maybe related to some of the questions that have been asked today.
Yeah, well, so a lot of the questions that we got were around how to implement this with different populations, with different clients, some of the techniques we use. And I think we were all in agreement that taking kind of a zoomed out look, rather than trying to teach any specific technique, to recognize that these are instruments, as we said before, right? They're instruments that have unique properties, just like a gong has a different quality than a guitar. A synthesizer has its own unique voice, and the more that you're able to explore it, the more you're able to find your expressive voice with any of these instruments, you'll be able to find the clinical implications, the clinical applications for it. So, I mean, we covered, like, as Josh just talked about, the drum machine as a co-therapist, right? Like, if it can hold that space for you and allow you to stand up and do something else, that's a unique property that it has. You know, a synthesizer with all of the tonal qualities will bring something else to the music and bring something else to your clients. And so, yeah, I mean, the deeper that you can get into any of these instruments, you have to learn it, just like you learn to play piano, but it will eventually pay off.
Yeah, and you know, we're not experts on this, although I consider my colleagues to be slightly more expert than me, who identifies as a novice, which we are exploring in our group process as well.
In different ways.
The validity of that, you know, that role that I've given myself. But I wanted to say that I'm really excited to present with my peers on something that I am really passionate about, especially because of my previous work and my current work, you know, working with people of color and working with people within the queer community who this is their music. And so, you know, using our access, using our resources, using our privilege to be able to provide some kind of context for, you know, what does working within music tech, working within this medium, how does that provide space for people who maybe weren't previously included? How does that provide just a means of being able to express your voice in a way that feels authentic and indigenous to your own culture? And I think there are a lot of really exciting ways that we can use technology to elevate our clients.
Yeah, the history of electronic music, whether we consider Wendy Carlos and Switched on Bach to current artists like Arca, who particularly trans artists who have explored breaking the binary of gender through sound itself. And we've talked in music therapy about engendered sound in some instance. JM talks about these things, but with digital music technology, sound can be morphed into something new. And artists are specifically looking at sound to break through the gender binary. And so, you know, those experiences inform the possibilities of clients not seeing themselves as something new within the sound itself, as Victoria is discussing, this kind of bringing in the culture into the clinical work is understanding all these little cultural significance of sound morphing.
And I think that comes from education. It starts with us taking this really seriously and seeing this as a viable path within music therapy, the same way we hold students to guitar and piano proficiency. This is a viable way of making music. This is a way of reaching people. And if you think about this from like a liberation theology or a liberation ideology, it's almost like uh, a lot of the people we work with have been told their whole lives that that music is the domain of a select few people who are rich and privileged and talented and have access. And this is a way we can democratize, because of all the software and hardware that exists in this world. We can bring all of the studio to people, and we can give them access to their full potential, and we can show them that music is their birthright, and being a musical being is something that's deep inside of them, and all we're doing is providing the right tools to help them actualize that.
Yeah, these tools are
Resource-oriented music therapy.
Yes.
yeah, they're available on every level, from a free phone app to, you know, however many thousands of dollars. There is every entry point for every person.
Yeah, and it's just like you said, Al, it's about finding your own music within it, so that it's not.
And it's our job to learn the language, you know. It's our responsibility.
And then it's a continuous education then after, because the relationships here, just because you know how to maybe within a MPC, maybe I learn how to sample, but that's like learning the G chord. I want to go into a clinical setting and be like, G chord, everybody is therapized. It's the same thing here. You have to build your relationship with the instrument, gain competency, gain proficiency. And there's so many different technologies that we can't show you how to do this. You have to take now the responsibility to build your relationships with something, learn the language, learn the cultural history, and expand upon it before bringing it in to the clinical session. So as we end today, just that is our invitation to you to do your own explorations, discover your own relationships, find people to make digital music with, improvise or write songs, or you find various platforms online to do it. But it's going to take a lifelong commitment to discovering artists, to discovering history, to discovering the technologies, to playing with those technologies, and to immerse yourself in it. So, and it's a fun world, and we hope that you enjoy. So, thank you, Josh, Victoria, Al. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And we'll leave our emails after this, and so contact us if you have any questions. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.